Biblical literalism isn't possible. What? Of course it is. This is a New Testament in Greek, the original language of the New Testament authors. Okay? Look at this page and see if you notice anything. What's that all on the bottom, below the Greek? That's the source that each verse draws from. What do you mean the source? This is a photo of one of the oldest sources that we know of. Wow, that's so cool! Where's the rest of it? Unfortunately, that's it. The oldest biblical sources are written on papyrus, and the older they are, the more likely they are to be incomplete or fragmented. When do we see the first fully intact Bible? Probably the Codex Vaticanus, one of the 4 great uncial codexes, which was written sometime between 300 and 350. Isn't that 200 years after the original texts were written? Yes. Why don't we have anything earlier? The early church was poor and persecuted, so they didn't have access to the archival resources of the later church, so we just have fragments that we piece together to make a complete Bible. So why wouldn't they use one of the complete uncials? There is significant textual variance between the uncial codexes that we have and the earliest papyri. What? Scribes had to handwrite every biblical book for the first 1500 years of the church, and this introduced a lot of differences between the texts. Some were mistakes, sometimes they would make a slight change for theological reasons, but as time went on, scribes were making copies of copies of copies, and rarely cross-referencing these texts with one another. So as time went on, the copies spread out with their variances like the branches of a tree. Precisely. But now we have access to the original? The earliest copies that we have are 100 to 200 years after the originals were written, but they're earlier on, so lower on that tree in that analogy. Here's a list of the most commonly used sources in the Nestle-Aland Greek New Testament. So how do we keep track of the sources? Here's the cool part. You remember that papyrus that I showed you earlier? That's a fragment of John 18, 31 through 33. It's called P52. Okay, and if we look at John 18, we can see in verse 33 a reference to that very text, P52. Wow, that's way more complicated than I thought. Yeah, it is. The Bible is beautiful and profoundly complicated, and our understanding of it comes from hundreds of fragments. That's why I say after you study the Bible,